The following is a special presentation of Carolina Business Review in conjunction with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Support for this program is provided by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising health care costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcosts.com.
There is something to be said about finding serious people to facilitate a serious dialogue with the idea of addressing serious issues. Not all, but certainly much of the dominant public discourse in the country these days is shrill when it needs to be sensible. It is pandering and personal when it needs to be intelligent and non-inflammatory. It is divisive when it needs to be inclusive. And it is unattractively partisan when it clearly needs to be just and fair-minded. Welcome to the Carolinas Conversation about current business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and on this very special Carolina Business Review from the new Uptown Charlotte campus of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, a conversation with the co-chairs of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, Senator Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles. Join us now for Telling It Like It Is. We are coming to you from the new, I might say, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte's campus in Uptown Charlotte. We're proud to be here. Just a little leading. Thank you for your indulgence there. There is Senator, Mr. Bowles, Mr. Simpson. You know, there is so much talk. There is so much acute debate. There are so many hurt feelings, if you will, and they're shrill voices. When we talk about deficits, and when we talk about revenue, when we talk about partisan and partisan politics, what do you think gets lost in this debate? When the core DNA things that we really need to focus on, Senator?
Well, first of all, we don't get to know each other anymore. We're off raising funds day and night. Your caucus consists of how do we diddle the Democrats today or how do we diddle the Republicans today. Nothing about what do we do for America today. How do I get back in the leadership? How do I get over the top of the guy in front of me for the leadership? It's like Macbeth. They got their daggers in the back, waiting to get to the top. Fundraisers, as I say. And it took us 4 months to establish trust in our commission when we started. There was ugliness, nastiness, cute remarks, sarcasm. And the theme coming out of the Democrats was, who's the biggest spending president in the history of the United States before this man? Answer, George W. Bush. Never vetoed a single spending bill in 6.5 years till it came to stem cell research. So after that simmered down, the other side said, but this guy, Obama, is 4 times worse than Bush with the stimulus and TARP and this and that. Finally, Erskine and I said, well, keep scrapping, and we'll just do a 2-member report, just the 2 of us. And we really meant that. And as we stuck with it, they trusted each other. We had Andy Stern, and the stereotyping that goes on now in America is disgusting. They said, is Andy Stern on your commission? Isn't he a commie? He's the union guy, isn't he? And we'd say, yeah, but he's not really a commie. He's a Democrat. And then they'd say, is Tom Coburn on your commission, that right-wing guy from Oklahoma, Dr. No? We said, yes. Guess what? Stern and Tom put together our suggestions as to what to do with the defense budget. And don't let anybody tell you, if you get into the defense budget, you're hurting the security of the United States, ladies and gentlemen. There's enough fat in there to last for everybody. So that's what we had to get through. We did, and it was a very cordial group, and 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans and 1 independent voted for it. That's 60%. That'll get you anywhere in a 60% modus, which is the filibuster. So it was tough.
You know, Erskine, you were in the Clinton White House when there was a balanced budget. You were the point of the spear. You were in those dialogues. What was different then versus now?
First of all, it's nice to be out of a witness protection program and to be at home. Al and I've been locked up for the last 9 months. Al says we've been very successful. We've achieved the pinnacle of our life. We pissed off everybody in America. And I think it's probably true.
I like the way you did that.
Yeah.
Such a truth.
It's really different today. The biggest difference to me was when President Clinton asked me if I would come back and serve as Chief of Staff and negotiate the balanced budget in 1997. We had a president who was committed to doing this, that was willing to put politics aside. And we had leadership in the Congress in Speaker Gingrich and Leader Lott who were willing to do the same thing. And to get it done, we had to gore a lot of oxes, but everybody thought that it was in the best interest of the country, and the leadership stepped up and we got it done. Today, the partisanship is pretty high, and it's much more difficult to get people to be willing to pull together rather than to pull apart. And as Al said, it took us about 4 or 5 months to build up trust. But once we did build up that trust, we were able to get a supermajority of this commission to vote for it. And they voted for specifics, not just generalities. And they voted to raise a little bit of revenue. About 1/4 of what we did was revenue, and 3/4 was in the form of spending cuts. And the spending cuts had to happen before the revenue could come into play. And the sum total of it yielded $4 trillion in deficit reduction. And $4 trillion is not the maximum amount we need to reduce the deficit over the next decade. It's not the ideal amount. It's the minimum amount we need to reduce the deficit in order to stabilize the debt and get it on a downward path as a percent of GDP. And as an example, we had 6 members of the U.S. Senate on our commission. 5 of them voted yes, all 3 Republicans and 2 of the 3 Democrats. And we had a very diverse group of people that ended up saying yes. The most liberal member of the Senate is probably Dick Durbin, who voted yes from Illinois. And the most conservative, as Al said, was Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, and he voted yes. So again, they put their politics aside and they did what they thought was right for the country.
So how did, you both talked about this before, and we had the honor actually to be in with the students out at the university today and had a great energy out there. So how did you build that trust? What does building trust look like when you have such divergent opinions? How do you get folks to just trust each other?
Well, they have to get to know each other. They have to remove the bias they have, clear a little of the political correctness out of their heads, and deal with things openly and honestly without the fear that somebody will run out the door and rat on them and put the heat on them. So we met sometimes in private, if you will. It's a terrible thing to do in an American democracy, but let me tell you, don't forget, the Founding Fathers didn't allow the press within 100 yards of the building when they were doing their work. And that's why they stuck the First Amendment on the books, to take care of a bunch of guys cranking out seditious literature in a basement in Philadelphia. But don't forget, they could never have achieved anything if you have to have guys who run out of the, and see a light nowadays, you're like a moth. And I said, there's a television camera. Oh God, I was thinking, wait a minute, no. Oh,
it gets better, by the way. It gets better.
Where the hell were we? Oh. Trust. We just came to know each other. And David Cote, who was an independent, I believe he was put on the commission as an independent, he got up one day after 4 months and took off his coat and said, "Who the hell are you people?" He said, if I ran a company like this, and he runs one, Honeywell, all over the world, he said, I'd be fired. You people know what to do, you know exactly how to get there, and you don't do anything, and you've just been in here arguing with each other. This is disgusting. And that was a defining moment that day. And then we had Javier Becerra, Democrat, represents a terribly sensitive area of minorities, and he put up a rule. He said, you know, I'm tired to listen to the fighting, but if you don't like what Bowles and Simpson are doing, put up your own plan or shut up. And man, that was gutsy. He's a good man. I don't know what he'll do. He's on this commission too. 4 of our guys.
The super committee?
Yeah. Beshara, Henserling, and Camp and Baucus were on ours, all voted against it for various reasons that they shared. But they're on this one. And so we'll see what happens.
What? Would you expect a different outcome with them on the super committee?
Yeah, I would. I would think one of them, we only need that one vote. If they're going to play sheer politics, 6-6, one of those guys is going to jump ship somewhere. And I don't know who it would be. And I wouldn't put the heat on them because whatever they do, they'll be savaged by the AARP and Grover Norquist.
But the world has changed a lot since December when we submitted our report.
How so?
Well, first of all, you know, I think the odds are better that we're going to get something to come out of this thing than it was a little while ago. And I think it's some chance that we can, because A, they only have to get a simple majority, and we had to get a supermajority. B, you all are better informed today than you were back in December of a year ago. You know, we had this whole debt default fiasco this summer, which I think people realized, boy, we got a real problem in this country. And secondly, we've seen what's going on in Europe, and we know that can happen to us. And if you look at our balance sheet, you can see that we have some of the same problems that they had. And thirdly, you have to realize that in this case, they've got a real hammer. They've got these across-the-board cuts of $1.2 trillion, $600 billion, which will happen in the defense budget, $600 in the non-defense budget, that will come raining down if they do nothing. And any time that you do across-the-board cuts, that's never the smart way to cut a budget. And I think they realize that. So I think there's a better chance they're more impelled to do something than they would be otherwise.
You know, but Ursula, let's stay with you for just a second on this. I mean, you arguably know a little bit about banking, certainly about investment banking. You know how business works, Senator, you do too. But Erskine, specifically with you, why is there, and maybe you're trying to impose this with this commission, but why is there not some mechanism like there is in the for-profit free market society that Schumpeter called, the economist Schumpeter called creative destruction? Why there doesn't seem to be a creative destruction component when it comes to either a government program or just the size of government? Am I wrong to think that?
I think the great Ronald Reagan said that the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. And I think he was probably right. And you have to remember that when people in government talk about cutting an expense, they're not talking about the kind of cut that any of you all would do in your companies where you would spend X amount this year and X minus 5% next year. What they're talking about is, well, the forecast was to spend Y, and here's X, and I'm going to spend a little bit less than Y, so I've cut. But I actually spent more. You know, that's not a cut in my book. So it's a whole different form of arithmetic you have to learn when you go to Washington.
Senator?
Well, I think we have, speaking of arithmetic, nobody understands what a trillion is. So when you start with a trillion, their eyes glaze over. A trillion is 1,000 billions. Here's one, without getting into religion, of course. The Big Bang Theory of the universe happened 13,600,000,000 years ago, and that's 1/3 of a trillion, and we owe 16 of those babies. Now no, there's really nothing funny about that. We owe 16, it's 15 today. Somebody said they read 15, but don't forget they extended the debt limit. That's what they did to get to this point. It'll be $16 trillion. Not only that, but the unfunded liabilities of this entire government. The guarantee pension fund is broke. This is broke. That's broke. Fannie Mae, Freddie, they're all broke. They're government-sponsored entities. And the unfunded liabilities of all of the programs of the U.S. is $63 trillion.
It is amazing. One of the ways we were successful is that we put aside the false arithmetic and we got people to focus on reality. And when you focus on reality, it's a pretty harsh lesson for America. Al and I came to the opinion that we face the most predictable economic crisis in history, that this fiscal path we're on is simply not sustainable. And if you were to try to think of an analogy, these deficits of over $1 trillion a year they're like a cancer, and they truly will destroy the country from within. And if I was just to give you one arithmetic example, take last year. We're not talking 20 years ago or 20 years in the future, last year. And you look at 100% of the revenue that came into the country. 100% of it was consumed by our mandatory spending and interest on the debt. Mandatory spending is principally the entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That means every single dollar we spent last year on these two wars, on national defense, homeland security, education, infrastructure, high value added research, every single dollar was borrowed, and half of it was borrowed from foreign countries. That is a formula for failure in any organization. And if this super committee decides to take the ostrich theory and just stick their heads in the ground, and we do nothing, by the year 2020, we will be spending over $1 trillion a year on interest alone. Now think about that. That's doubly bad for America. It's bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, that's $1 trillion we can't invest in this country, in education or in infrastructure or in research to create the next new thing. But it's also $1 trillion that is going to be invested in Asia to educate their kids, to build their infrastructure, to create the next new thing over there so the jobs of the future are there, not here. That's nuts. And that's what we wanted to put a stop to. And all of these guys who came up to us with the political talking points, it drove Al and me crazy. You know, they said, oh, we can grow our way out of this problem. You could have double-digit growth for decades and not solve this problem. Other people, you know, Democrats, there's usually one or two in the audience, the Democrats would come tell me, oh, we can tax our way out of a problem. You can't solely tax your way out of a problem. Raising taxes doesn't do a darn thing to change the demographics of a country or to change the fact that healthcare costs are growing at a faster rate than GDP. And if you wanted to solve it, you know, with taxes alone, you'd have to raise the highest marginal rate to 70%, the corporate rate to 80%, the cap gains and dividend rate to 50%. How many businesses are going to be started in Charlotte with that? Zero. It's like crazy. And the other groups come and say, well, we'll just solve it with cuts. Believe me. But what they're talking about, you see them on these Sunday shows, they say, I want to solve it with cuts, but I'm not going to touch Medicare, I'm not going to touch Social Security, I'm not going to touch, you know, interest on the debt, and I'm certainly going to make sure that, you know, that we stay safe and secure, so I'm not going to touch defense. Well, if you leave all that alone, you got to cut everything else by about 75%. So what we said is, let's get real. Let's do what we have to do. And if we had to do a 2-page report or a 2-person report, that's what we're willing to do.
What is the magic ratio of raising revenue and spending cuts?
On the revenue side, basically what we said is we have the most anti-competitive, inefficient, ineffective tax code that man could dream up. It's just crazy. You know, we net, people just can't believe this, we net $1.1 trillion in total tax revenues coming into the country. And people say, how can our tax rates be here and we net so relatively little? It's because we have $1.1 trillion of spending in the tax code. It's just backdoor spending. There are these deductions and credits, many of which people in this room like. So what we said is, hey, let's get rid of all of them, 100% of them. If you do that, There are 1.1 trillion of them, and let's use 92% of that money to reduce rates and 8% to reduce the deficit. That would yield about $100 billion a year to reduce the deficit, or about $1 trillion over 10 years. So that's where our revenue came from. And we could take rates, and you correct me if I miss this, 8% up to $70,000, 14% up to $210,000, and a maximum rate of 23%. And we could take the corporate rate down to 26%, and we could pay for a territorial system so that $1 trillion that's now captured overseas could be brought back to this country to create jobs here. I think that would create dynamic growth, it'd create lots of jobs here, and it certainly makes a lot more sense.
North Carolina Treasurer Janet Cowell was here, and she gave me a question, which I thank you, Madam Treasurer, for that, by the way. And the question was, and I like this, can we get back to bipartisan collaboration without structural congressional reform? Will it work?
There have always been terrible struggles of partisanship. I mean, nobody has caned anybody lately. That happened with the South Carolina delegate years ago. He died of the injuries later. No one has risen on the floor and described their colleague, my genial colleague, as a rancid tub of lard. That's actually in the congressional record. It's always been there. And the intensity of it is different now in your city council, this lovely county commissioner, chairman. This didn't start in Congress. It starts in the school board, in the city hall, and the county commissioners. People are nasty, and they come in nasty, and they get up and they shout. And you know, I've always said that in the general public, or your church or your business, 15% of those people are screwballs, lightweights, or boobs. and you must have those people represented in Congress. They have to be there.
I love that. Yeah.
But I'll tell you, the bitterness is tougher because of radio talk shows and television. People talking across each other, vicious stuff, lying. I mean, absolute lying on the right and the left, getting people all worked up, and they make a ton of money off of you and me. That's what they do. They're entertainers. They don't have any facts usually. They just come in there to get everybody worked up. Everything we have suggested, or any group in America has suggested to do something with Social Security, doesn't affect anybody over 60. And I get the most vicious letters from people over 60 and 70 and 80. Foul, I mean foul stuff. I'm good at that, but boy, I tell you. And they don't care about their grandchildren because they don't get a thank you at Christmas. And they walking on their pants with their caps on backwards, listen to Snoopy, Snoopy, Poop Dog, and Enema Man. There's a real break in society. And all let me get to this one quickly, give me an instant. We're trying to make Social Security solvent for its own sake. And look at these ARP ads. Here's this old coot being paid a fortune. He goes, "We know where you are. We vote. We'll find you." I mean, let me tell you, if you can't stabilize Social Security for its own sake without these guys saying, "You're balancing the budget on the backs of poor old seniors," that is an absolute terminological inexactitude, which means lie. And so what Erskine and I say, we say we're going to stabilize it for 75 years for the young people that we met today, wonderful young people. And by doing that, we give 125% of poverty to the lowest 20%. We give an extra kick for 80 to 85, 1% extra. We raise the wages subject to the tax to 190 grand over 10 years. We change the cost of living index to a more relevant, market-oriented thing. We do these things. We change the bend points to make it more progressive so the rich guy pays a little more. We take care of the guy who can't work. He's burned out. We don't raise his retirement. And then we do a hideous, hideous recommendation. We will raise the retirement age to 68 by the year 2050.
We want to give people a chance to get ready.
Yeah. And the AARP said, well, how will people get ready? We said, I don't know, they'll just have to somehow. But the retirement age will go to 67 in the year 27. And this program started in the 30s, and the retirement age was 65 because life expectancy was 63.
Roosevelt was pretty smart.
He was.
Yeah.
And now the life expectancy is 78, and we can't do anything. And 16 people were paying into the system when I was struggling for the university. Well, don't yawn, Du Bois. I saw you over there. You just get up, and Lisa, give him. 16 people were paying into the system when I was a freshman at the university and 1 taking out. Today there are 3 people paying into the system and 1 taking out, and in 10 years there'll be 2 people paying in and 1 taking out. And the AARP said they would help us. They haven't done 1 lick, not 1 lick. And so listen to the AARP and do nothing, do nothing, and there isn't a statistician or an actuary that will tell you that in the year 2036, you'll waddle up to the window and get a check for 23% less. And I think that's rotten, absolutely rotten. And that's where they are. And it's going to get less every year after that. And the law says you don't get the scheduled benefits, so tear that baby up if you got gray hair. You'll get only the payable benefit. And you can sue or shriek or go into the streets, and that's all you're going to get. And that's tough in my mind. I think that stinks.
Senator Erskine, you know, you talk about 2 things here. You talk about tactical politics, and you talk about behavior. Okay, let's say you do get the Commission on Reform. Let's say you get it the way you want it, you get it passed, but how can you make sure that the character, that you can't legislate character? So you were talking about that it is getting nastier. We all see it, we all feel it, and we all don't like it. So what do we do about that?
Dear colleague.
Yeah.
I babbled on a little extra there. You were going to let me get my foot deeper and deeper into it. Go ahead, answer the damn question.
I should never answer a political question. I have empirical data, but I'm not very good at politics. Al and I have something in common. Both of our fathers ran for governor, and both of us ran for the Senate. We had a little bit different results, but so I don't usually do the political questions. It's really tough today, and I think one of the things that makes it really hard is over time, as the districts, particularly the congressional districts, have been divided up, they become either predominantly Republican or predominantly Democrat districts. And the elections held in the primary, not in the general election. And so at least in Congress, you end up with people that are pretty far to the right and pretty far to the left. And you don't have as many people left in what I would call the sensible center. And therefore, it's much more difficult to get anything done. We have some really big problems in this country. This is one of them, for sure. But we also have an infrastructure that's crumbling. We have an education system that's not producing a globally competitive product. We have a healthcare system that's absolutely ludicrous. We have an energy program that doesn't have a plan and doesn't have a way to break our reliance on overseas petroleum. You know, these are big problems that we got to face up to. And what drives me crazy, it's our generation that ought to do this. And we can't leave it to the next generation of people who will sit in these seats 20 years from now, because it'll be too late. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring these big issues to a forefront and say, let's do our part. Let's have a little bit of sacrifice in all of these areas in order to make the country stronger and better able to compete globally in the future. And I think if we do it.
Senator, we're taking some questions from the audience, and City Councilman Edwin Peacock writes, will you repeat and explain your definition of politics?
Oh, this is it. It's very short. It's all mine. In politics, there are no right answers, only a continuing flow of compromises among groups, resulting in a changing, cloudy, and ambiguous series of public decisions where appetite and ambition compete openly with knowledge and wisdom.
Well done.
There are more people now dealing with appetite and ambition than ever knowledge and wisdom today.
And Erskine, Dave Craven is the student body president at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and he writes, what is the role of higher education in the economic recovery?
Hey, look, today we live in a knowledge-based global economy, and there's no question about that. And if we don't make sure that our young people have the knowledge and skills they need to compete, then we're going to be left by the wayside. It doesn't mean we have to spend money willy-nilly. When I was had Tom's job, when I was president of the university, you know, I used to go around all the time saying, gosh, we have to make smart investments in education if we're going to be competitive. And one of the things I wanted to do was to make sure that we at the university admitted that we were not only part of the solution to the problems for K through 12, but we were also part of a problem. And by that I meant, you know, we produce most of the teachers. And I felt we had to produce not just more teachers, but better teachers and more math and science teachers. And so we embarked on a program to do that and to reform our schools of education. And I asked on one of my first days, I said, well, aren't there some federal programs that we can turn to provide resources to help us improve the quality of teacher education? And sure enough, there were some. There were 82. Now, do we need 1 or 2 or 3 really good programs? You bet. But we don't need 82. We do $1.5 billion worth of research at the University of North Carolina. Is all of that high value-added research? Absolutely not. We live today in a world of limited resources. And limited resources mean one thing: priorities, choices. I told somebody it's a little bit like this Nobel Prize winning scientist, Ernst Rutherford, said when his Nobel project was running out of money, he turned to his team and said, hey, we're running out of money. Now we got to start thinking. Well, that's what we are, America. We're running out of money. We got to start thinking. It's no different than when you go through a leveraged buyout or when you're trying to operate a business and your revenues have gone down, as ours have, and your expenses are going up. You've got to make choices. You've got to set priorities. And if we don't do that in our generation, we're going to leave a mess to the next generation for sure.
Jim Babb, thank you, Jim, wrote another question. By the way, if you have a question, hold your card up. Can't guarantee that we're going to get it. We've got a couple up here in the audience, about 2/3 of the way up. So if you hold your card high so some of our spotters can see it. Jim Babb says, Erskine, Senator, are you as a team prepared to campaign and/or endorse those who to commit to supporting your recommendations?
Oh, we don't beat them up. There's no need to do that. They know what to do. Every single one of them knows exactly what to do. Why would you go? I tell you, I think the people who chicken out this trip and don't get this done, and November 12 comes up, I think they're going to get beat. That's my hope. I think the guys that chicken out and won't bite the bullet, won't do what they know they have to do, will go back to their constituents and get up and say, well, you're waste, fraud, and abuse, and Nancy, you didn't like. No, you didn't have the guts to take into the Big Four And we're going down the tube. In a year, the tipping point could come. What is the tipping point? Erskine, if you remember, Durbin kept asking that. Where's the tipping point? Right. The tipping point won't come on any screen. It won't come with any PowerPoint. It'll come when the markets decide that this is a totally dysfunctional bunch of squirrels who can't get anything done, who can't get it done. And these are good people, but they will call them names like squirrels and everything. They'll say these are boobs, these are idiots, buffoons, and that's unfair. But they've got pressures from you and from the ARP and from veterans and this and on and cowboys and Indians and farmers. No, don't forget what's out there. And let me just mention one thing in the Defense Department. We asked them how many contractors they had, and they said, well, it's quite a range. It's between 1 million and 10 million.
Very narrow range.
Very narrow band. And then we said, well, how much do they get paid? Conrad, the Democrat, asked for an audit years ago. They said, we don't audit. There's no way to audit the defense budget or the contractors. No way to audit them at all. And then there are these programs. So if you want to know how tough it is, pick this one. And if I weren't a veteran, they would have burned my house. I was on active duty for 2 years in Germany. I was in the reserve. If I'd spent just a few more years, I would have been in I would be a military retiree. Now, I know what they gave up. I know that. Maybe I know, too, that maybe 10 or 12% of them were in combat or combat theater. Many of them were totally in the reserves, totally in the National Guard, and they are military retirees. Doesn't matter what they went on to and what they made after that. And they have their own health care plan called TRICARE. And the premium is $470 a year and no copay. And it takes care of all their dependents, and it costs $53 billion a year. We went to Gates. We said, hey, Bob, surely you could do something with this. This is impossible. You can't continue a program like this. He said, be my guest. I don't want to get torn apart for the 8th time by the professional veterans, the VFW, the American Legion, the DAV, and I'm a member of those groups, except for the DAV. And I'm telling you, you try to get, that's what's out there in this country. And people will come up to me and say, you hate veterans. You're a commie, you're a pig. I said, pal, I'm a realistic American, and anybody who's working at a 6-figure job after being a military retiree that can't cough up more than $470 a year, which is nuts, and you're nuts. I mean, I get it. It's absolutely impossible. That's the stuff that's out there.
Let me give you an example. This is every time that Al and I go talk somewhere, and we've done, gosh, 100 or so of these now, trying to get people to really join us in this fight. And people ask us, well, what is the cause of these deficits? You know, why do we have them? And we always say, well, you tell us. And every time they say the same things. They say it's waste, fraud, and abuse. It's
Nancy Pelosi's aircraft.
Nancy Pelosi's aircraft.
Congressional salary.
Yeah, all subsidies and foreign aid. And that's what we hear all the time. And you could take all of those and glop them together, and it would be a really, really minor part of any part of a problem. The problem really comes from 4 things. And if I forget, you got to help me out.
Oh, you're doing pretty well. We haven't had anything to drink, that's for sure. These are.
But we're going to.
Yeah, but they don't. They've had a few.
Yeah. The first cause of these deficits, by far the biggest cause, is health care. We spend twice as much on health care in this country as any other developed nation, whether you talk about it as a percent of GDP or on a per capita basis. And our outcomes, we rank somewhere between 25th and 50th in things like infant mortality and life expectancy and preventable death. So we're not getting much bang for our buck. Healthcare is by far the biggest. Second biggest is defense. You know, we spend more than the next 14 largest countries combined on national defense. You know, it's causing us to hollow out the country. And I'll tell you how crazy it is. You know, we have this treaty with China, with Taiwan, that will protect them if they're invaded by China. The only problem is we'll have to borrow some money from China to do it. You know, it's like crazy. And even Admiral Mullen, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, says, you know, that our biggest national security problem is these deficits because they just eat up all the resources we need. The third biggest problem is one we've already talked about, is we give away half of our tax revenue in the form of tax earmarks, you know, deductions and credits. And we have this totally anti-competitive tax code. And the fourth is, boy, interest on the debt, you know, compound interest. And, you know, some of you here in this room have lived with compound interest, and it is an enormous problem this country faces. And if we don't face up to this debt, all of these are going to come home.
Let me just, if I might, let me just mention Medicare, because people bring it up, say it's precious, and the AVRP and all that. You've heard me babble on it. But let me tell you why you know here that it can't work. Because you know people who have had a $150,000 heart operation and don't even get a bill. And they have Medigap, and they have this, and they don't get a bill for anything. Well, why the hell wouldn't you show up at your doctor continually if you never get a bill when you're on Medicare, regardless of your net worth or your income? And people say, well, how do we protect the old people? Well, I tell you what we do. We start affluence testing people. And if you got a wad, you're going to pay something for something that you have, an operation. They'll say, well, that's unchristian and undemocratic and evil. Okay, but let's look at it. We're going to take care of pre-existing conditions in children and that might live to be 60. This is not a nasty statement. One person in the United States weighs more than the other two. We have diabetics 1, diabetes 2. We got people who choose to do booze and get heart disease. We got people who choose to do tobacco and do it. We got kids now dipping into a bowl and doing pharma parties, and we don't even know what the hell they're frying, but they're using their grandparents' prescription drugs to happy up. And they're frying themselves. And we're going to take care of all that. Well, I tell you, then we're going to have to do something that's very painful for me. You're going to have to do tort reform. I got 2 trial lawyer sons. I started the Wyoming trial lawyers. I'm ready to do that. And you got to take doctors down a peg, and you got to take providers down a peg, and you got to make hospitals keep 1 set of books instead of 2. That's what you do. This is very popular material. And that's where it is. It's beyond your comprehension. And Medicaid, beautiful woman in our town, 92 years old, she didn't have any money. She lasted 10 days. We all loved her, tried to keep her going, and her children were stunned when they got the bill for $900,000. But they gave her the airlift. It's important to have the airlift, although it's only 20 miles away, because that costs a real bundle. And then the ambulances, and then the sonar, and then whether she should have a heart transplant at 92. Didn't do that, but I mean, doctors are terrified by lawyers. They over-prescribe. They don't over-prescribe. They over the diagnosis. Anyway, those are terrible things to talk about. And if you do, you're nasty, you're smart aleck, you're ugly. It's just very sad. It's all personal now. Your idea is not stupid. You are stupid. That's what it is now. You've personalized the thing.
What we figured out on health care was based on a lot of experiences that people had. As Tom Ross has been so lucky to learn, the public health care system in North Carolina, reports to the president of the university. And before I went down there, I had a chance to be vice chairman of Carolina's Medical here. So I had some experience in health care. And one of the things we know is the 50 million people in this country who don't have health care insurance get health care. They just get it to the emergency room, where it costs 5 to 7 times the amount it does in the doctor's office. And that cost doesn't just disappear. It gets cost shifted. And it gets cost shifted to you in the form of higher taxes and higher insurance costs. So what we said is, look, we think everybody ought to have health care insurance, but if everybody's going to have health care insurance, then by God, we as a taxpayer shouldn't pay for anybody to have a Cadillac plan, but we ought to provide people a pretty good Chevrolet. And of course, that got us into a lot of trouble with the unions. We also said, but look, everybody ought to have some skin in the game. We ought to do away with first dollar coverage. And that wasn't a very popular thing. But we said if everybody's going to have health care insurance, then everybody's got to have a medical home. And if everybody's got to have a medical home, then it means we got to have more primary health care providers, which means we need more primary care physicians, more nurse practitioners, more physician's assistants. And that means that universities like ours ought to be training more of those types of healthcare providers than specialists. We also said, look, if people are going to have prescription drugs, then by golly, if the taxpayers are going to pay for it, then they ought to, have generic drugs if those are available. In addition, we said, hey, look, why in the world should we as taxpayers, subsidize the cost of prescription drugs? Why in the world should Medicare be able to negotiate for the price of prescription drugs? Today they pay 40% more for prescription drugs than the VA does. That's crazy because that's the taxpayers paying it. We also said, as Al said, that anybody who doesn't believe doctors and other healthcare providers practice defensive medicine is crazy. They do. You see it every day, and that drives up the cost of healthcare. So we said there's got to be real tort reform, real malpractice reform. We also said, look, we got to start paying for quality, not quantity. And we got to do something about this whole end-of-life scenario without talking about things like, death squads and things like that. And we think if we do that and we put it in hard form arithmetic, which is what we did, you can really bring down the cost of health care.
Erskine, last summer, when Congress could not agree on a debt limit and Treasury markets, for all practical purposes, were more than just unstable. Do you think that was a tipping point when it came to the public's perception of what Washington can do or not do?
I think it was a learning experience. I thought that was pitiful. I thought it was disgusting. I know it hurt our global reputation. People, other countries, companies throughout the world lost a lot of confidence that we as a nation would actually stand up and do something about our long-term fiscal problems. And you could see that in the credit default swap market. That's where you go, buy insurance against a default on various types of debt instruments. And the premium you would pay in July of last year on a default on U.S. Treasuries was greater than the premium you'd pay for default on the debt of Mexico, Panama, the Philippines. I mean, it's pitiful. And it hurt us a lot. And as you all know, the S&P downgraded our credit. Luckily, Moody's and Fitch didn't, but they put us on negative watch. And I believe if we don't stand up and do something about these huge deficits and get them under control, that you'll see us have further downgrades. And in time, when the world quits focusing on Europe and starts focusing on us, we'll no longer be the best-looking horse in the glue factory. They'll come after us. And when it does, you want to see these deficits go up, you just look at what's happened when interest rates return to normal levels.
And when this happens, this is the terrible irony. When this happens and the tipping point comes, and don't forget, Italy's on the ropes with a debt of $2.6 trillion. We're on the hook for $16 billion, and Italy's a trillion. And Italy, as I say, is $2.6 trillion. But the tipping point, when it comes, interest rates will shoot up and inflation will shoot up, and guess who gets hurt the worst? The little guy. The most vulnerable people in society will be the most hurt in that scenario. The money guys will always take care of themselves. They always have. The reason they used two-wheeled hand carts in the Middle Ages was so they could get the artworks rolled up and move and stick the gold in the bottom of the cart. And they will always take care of themselves. And the little guy is the guy that's going to get hammered. And he will.
Senator, can we do this, though? Can we do any of this? And Erskine, same question. Can we do this without real election reform? Without, you know, no more 5 or 6 terms in Congress or Senate or the Senate?
I don't think that's the problem. I really don't. There are a lot of good people up there. I'll give you a good example.
Yep.
You know, I ran against Richard Burr, and obviously nobody's calling me senator today.
They've called us everything.
Yeah, they called us everything else. But we couldn't have been successful on our commission without the help of Richard Burr. He went to Tom Coburn, who was on our commission, who's one of his closest friends and probably the most conservative member of the Senate. And he said, you know, you can trust these guys. You know, you can work with them. Give them a chance. And that's all you can ask for. There are plenty of people up there. Again, everybody understands the arithmetic. All those guys get the economics. I've worked with every single member of this super committee, and we know them well. It's whether or not they have the political will to do it. And the only people who can give them the political will is you. And when I go talk to business groups, you know, and I've spent my life in the business world, and, you know, we're as big a cowards as those guys in Congress are. Because, you know, people will come up to me and say, this is the right thing to do, let's do it. You know, we got to reform the tax code, we got to reduce health care spending, we got to get Social Security to be sustainably solvent. I'm for it. I'll help you. And then they go talk to their Washington lobbyist, and the Washington lobbyist says, oh, you can't do that, because if you do that, you know, they may get mad at us, and they won't help us on this one deal. We've got to put that one deal aside. Everybody is like my mama. My mama told me, she said, Erskine, I'm so proud of you. You're doing everything just right. You're being fiscally conservative. Your daddy be proud of you, but don't mess with my Medicare. You know?
Senator, we literally have about a minute left. Do you want to add to that?
I'm just saddened when I go, and when Erskine and I wandered around the campus for a year, there were guys that I really respected, and I do to this day, both parties, who said, save us from ourselves. How would you like to hear that from your elected representative? And they meant it. They weren't fooling at all. They have the heat. And let's just deal with one other little bit of heat. There's a guy wandering the earth in his Messiah robes named Grover Norquist. He represents the Americans for Tax Reform. He went to all these people during the glory years where the flowers were strewn, and he said, sign a pledge that you will never raise taxes under any situation unless there's a corresponding spending decrease. And they signed. 95% of the Republicans in both houses have signed it, either one time or another. Those who signed it years ago, a couple of them have said that was years ago, not now. And so he takes it out, and then Coburn went in and took $6 billion from ethanol, took it right out of the tax code as a tax expenditure, and Grover called that a tax increase. And Coburn said that's ludicrous. Not only ludicrous, it's deceptive. So here's this guy, and he can't murder you. He can't burn your house. The only thing he can do to you is defeat you for re-election. And if that means more to you than your country in extremity and doing something, you shouldn't be in Congress.
Nicely said. Senator Simpson, Erskine Bowles, you are kind for your service. If you have not read this, there is an executive summary in there. There's no reason why you should not read this Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. I would highly suggest it. You can get into the dialogue. You can get into the debate. Gentlemen, thank you once again. Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, good night, and thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks, Phil.
We're going to stand here for a second. Thank you.
This has been a special presentation of Carolina Business Review in conjunction with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Support for this program was provided by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising health care costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcosts.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.